All right, friends. Hey, before we get started, we want to do... oh, by the way, we are going to get started here in just a moment, so if you guys get back to your seats, that'd be wonderful.
I'm looking to make sure I'm ready to go.
You look like I look on a Sunday. During reading time, I always come up and check to see if I'm ready to go. I don't know, what is my stuff? Forget where your stuff was?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to make sure that you guys know, obviously those of you who've been in ministry for any time and put on an event, there's the idea, there's the thing that you want to have happen, and then there's all the people that's required to actually do it. And so we want to just point out for a moment and honor those people. Joy Struby has been the person who has helped facilitate all of this. If you actually thought any of those emails were coming from Ron, it was all Joy. So she worked closely with Ron to help make this happen. So Joy, you're incredible, as well as the rest of the team, those who came in to serve, who have been volunteers. So thank you guys so much.
Hey, thanks again, Rob and Kelly and the team for putting all this together. Thank you, girls. We really do appreciate it. Just thank you so much. You guys always do such a good job, make everyone feel welcome, and we really do appreciate that. It really is a gift, and you've been given the gift of hospitality, and we've been the recipients of your hospitality. So thank you, and we're all that much better. So thank you very much. And Joy, thanks. Joy made it all happen with this, and with a team too. Yes, of course. Amazing team. So, yeah, that's, thank you.
Why don't you guys give them one more round of applause? All right, friends, our last speaker today is Morris Dirks. And Morris has been in ministry for many, many years. For the first 10, did a lot of youth ministry, like many of us started out in. Spent another almost 20 years in a variety of pastoral experiences, some really positive and some not. And then about 11 years ago, founded Soul Formation, which, as we mentioned earlier, is a resource for pastors and ministry leaders dealing with emotional health and spiritual care. And so Morris has a doctorate degree in spiritual formation and leadership from George Fox University, has had the privilege of being able to study under people like Richard Foster, Eugene Peterson, still super bitter about the Eugene thing. Like, that is so cool. I'm so envious. Really well done. He's married to Ruth, has a private counseling practice underneath that Soul Formation umbrella, committed to the spiritual and the emotional health of Christian leaders. They've got 2 adult kids, and Morris, thank you for contributing your gifts to us. Would you welcome up Mr. Morris Dirks?
Thank you, James, wherever you are. Oh, there you are. Well, the food was phenomenal. Everyone's tired. They stuck me on third after 2 phenomenal sets of communicators that have been up already. Thanks for screwing me over, Ron. If you're going to use that kind of language, so will I. So we do work with people, and in your folders is this. Not that we need to promote it. It just keeps filling up. We're on cohort 10. There's always 27 people, 4 retreats. It's about spiritual formation, and the reason we throw it in there is just want to make it available to you. But I want to just highlight. I work with some other people that we've learned something ourselves from that academy. Paul Rhodes is at the back over there. Paul is now the executive director of Soul Formation. I decided after 11 years I was going to pull back and just do what I love doing. And Paul has the gift of administrative oversight. And then Tim Barton is on our board right beside right beside Paul. And there's others that are working and on staff. But at our academy, one of the academies, maybe we're third cohort in, we're down the road a ways, I decided to do a talk on shame. And I decided to use Brene Brown video. And we thought it would just be helpful to understand shame. And it lit up. It just all of a sudden, what I thought was sort of going to be an average, 3-day, 4-day event, we're going to drop this one in there just because it's going to be okay. It lit up and everybody started to respond to shame. And so what has happened here today as a result of Ron and Annette and Greg is stunning, because this is the secret weapon of the enemy that he has seeded into the life of every person on planet Earth. And your sacred stories, the three of you, have exposed it. And I feel like I'm usually, when I give this talk, feel like I got to start the train up at mile 1 and get some energy going. I feel like we are 75 miles an hour already going after your talks. And I get to come in and try to help us put some more things together and wrap it up and sign off today. So thank you very much for what you guys have done. I was in an accident as a teenager. I was riding my 10-speed bicycle down the main street of the city where I grew up in Canada, and a car made a left turn looking for traffic, seeing none, stepped on the gas, and then just drove over me. And when he was done, I was looking up at the muffler, and I thought I was going to die. I didn't. And but I went to the hospital for a month with a broken pelvis in 3 spots and a broken jaw in 2 and teeth knocked out. I was wearing cutoffs on a T-shirt, so I was just ripped raw from top to bottom. And while I was in the hospital, my leg, which was in traction because they have to put weights on to pull it out of joint a little bit, so your leg's up in the air and weights are down the backside. My leg was in traction, and all of a sudden one day they came in and noticed that it was getting swollen and really thick and stiff. And they said, you've got a blood clot. And they treated me for that in the bed there, and that was that. Until about 15 years ago, when I was preaching in Woodinville, a church I'm going to refer to here, just on the east side of Seattle, near Kirkland and Redmond and all those places, Bellevue, Washington, just on the other side of the lake from Seattle. I was preaching. I came home from Woodinville Alliance Church, and I felt weird, and I pulled my pant up, looked down, and everything above my sock was swollen, hard. And I called my wife right away into the room, and I just said, this feels exactly what I felt when I was 17 years old when I had the blood clot. And we took off and went to Evergreen Hospital on the east side, and they did, and sure enough, I had a blood clot like I did the first time, from here, my groin, down to my bottom of my calf, all the way down. So this time they did more tests. This is my second blood clot. And they told me that I have, if I can pronounce it right, prothrombin, some of you can do better, gene mutation. And they said, you are predisposed to blood clots. And so I take warfarin on a regular basis, which helps. You hear it advertised or not advertised on TV because people are telling you there's something better now. There's always something better that you're supposed to ask your doctor for, right? But my doctor says, no, you need to stick with this. It's rat poison. Did you know that? So I take rat poison every day. A little bit. And it thins my blood. Your blood is about at what they call it a 1 if you do an INR. I don't know what the letters stand for, so the nurse here will tell me. But I go in monthly, I do my INR, and they want my INR between 2 and 2.5. Just a little thinner than the average person to protect me. And that's been going on now since 2003, I guess. I have a gene mutation. I've had it all my life. It could be passed on to my kids who need to go to the doctor and do a blood test and still haven't done it. because it passes along through the male side of the family, and I had it all my life and didn't know it was there. I had shame rocking my life, my whole life, and so do you. I didn't know it was there. I didn't understand shame till I was about 50 years old. I knew a lot about a lot of stuff in ministry and life, but I did not understand shame. That church that I was in was the place that exposed me to shame, because my whole life had been different than Greg's, which was a down and into the closet in a destructive relationship early in life. Mine was up and to the right. My first memory of a great thing happening in my life was winning the track and field trophy in first grade, and the plaque going up on the wall in the school with my name, first grade, track and field, Morris Dirks. And I mean, to this day, I can feel that moment of winning that. And the rest of my life in sports, in hockey, in becoming a Christian, in leadership, and in all those things, then becoming a lead pastor, church growing, and all, it's always up and to the right. Until we moved from Salem, Oregon, where I pastored the Salem Alliance Church, to the Seattle Church, to Woodinville. And in 5 years, I went from riding a heroic journey. If you study Richard Rohr, I was on my heroic journey until my mid-40s. And from mid-40 to age 50, I hit a wall so hard. And Rohr says, the higher you go on your heroic journey, the harder the fall when you come off the backside. And there's been times I've asked God, like, so why did you let me go on this heroic journey so long and not know I was going to come off the backside and it was going to hurt so much? I was not aware of shame. And I was working in a church that was shame-induced in all of its programs, ministries, relationships, staff. There was a shame DNA running through the heart of that church, that I didn't know. I was going from a church that I knew nothing about shame, or very little, to a church that was going to flip me upside down. It's where I started to study the Enneagram and found out I was a 2 on the Enneagram. For those of you who are with Greg and me on this, I found out I was a 2 on the Enneagram, and that means I need to please people, but the reason I do it is because I need to be needed. I want to be not wanted. I like to be liked. So I love you, so you will love me. That's a selfish kind of love. That's a twisted kind of love that I had learned to work very well to get people to like me, to avoid shame. And I had mastered it without realizing it. But I got to a church where the dysfunction in that church was such that, as good as I was at practicing the dark side of being a 2, though I didn't even realize what I was doing, I thought I was just loving people. As good as I was, I could not make everyone happy in that church. In fact, the core of that church, we grew, but the core of that church, so many of them remained unhappy and unsettled, that I was continually up against a group of people that always felt like there was something wrong in the church, and they were key players in the life of that church. And I took that weight on personally and tried to bring that church back to health, and finally I caved in. And so I wrote a book on spiritual direction. It's where my life has gone now. After I ended at Woodinville, God redirected me and with other staff and some key people into soul formation ministry. And at the beginning of my book, which is available if you want to know more about spiritual direction, and which is really a place to process shame. It's an incredible place, if you have a spiritual director, to come to grips with the shame of your life in a safe place. My book starts out chapter 1, first words, I have totally and completely lost my way. Those were the first words to come out of my mouth as I spoke to the psychiatrist in the opening moments of my initial appointment. Tears streamed down my cheeks. My wife Ruth sat beside me, a true soul friend who had walked with me through the past 4 years as I slowly but surely slid from optimism and joy in ministry into an extended season of painful disillusionment. I walked into the psychiatrist's office out of sheer despair. I had already been to a Christian therapist, but the depression and anxiety remained lodged deep in my soul. Somehow I had to find my way back to emotional and spiritual equilibrium. I never dreamed ministry disappointment would result in needing professional help as a necessary step to recover. I was overwhelmed by shame. I did not handle the pain of that church the way I should to turn it into a sacred wound for about 5 years. And then I started to come to grips with the need that this wound needs to not be a place of embitterment, but it needs to become a place where it is and it has become a sacred wound. I used to come home from work from that church, and my mantra that I would say to my wife, and if Ruth were here today, she could confirm, my mantra was, and this is a great pastoral motto, screw them all. You don't need me for a pastor when I have that going on inside my soul. But that's how far down the road I was of anger and frustration and bitterness at the unwillingness of people to let go of their issues and to come along for the ride of what God was doing. Screw them all. So actually, I carried that wound for quite a while. Never became sacred. All the shame that was wrapped around it simply became unaddressed shame that I carried with me. And we started Soul Formation, and I started working with pastors. And there's a pastors network out of British Columbia that's now met for 10 years, and we always go away for a retreat. These are pastors of a large church network, and I am asked to lead them every year. And after about the third retreat, we're on Orcas Island together, and it's a stormy, rainy, windy night. And we're in a nice restaurant together at a long table. There's about 10 or 12 of us, a long table. And the lights, electricity goes off, and everybody else has left the restaurant, and here's a group of 12 pastors at the table. And they come out to us, and they said, we cook off gas. We still going to cook the meal. They brought out and lit candles up all across the table, and we just started to have the time of our lives together as 12 pastors. Let our hair down. One guy went up to the piano. There was a stage, went up to the piano in this, what was a restaurant that had theater from time to time, started playing Beatle tunes, and we all started singing Beatle tunes out loud and just having the time of our life. When I turned to the district superintendent who had contracted me to do this kind of work with the pastors, and I said to him, we need a toast. We need a toast. And he looked at me and said, what would we toast? And I just go, I don't know. It just feels like we should. You guys all have beer in front of you. I'm not a beer drinker, but they're all got their beer and their wine, and I said, we should have a toast. And finally what came into my mind was I had already told him my story about I was at the lowest place with the screw 'em all feeling and coming home and saying it. And I grabbed my drink, and I said, we need to have a toast to all of the people who left our church and never said goodbye. Screw them all. And everybody went, yeah! Wow. And I thought, that went over. Let's try another one. To all of the people who sent us unsigned letters that were nasty. Screw them all. And everybody went, yeah! And then I sat back in my chair, and the district superintendent leaned over to me, and he said, that felt good. That felt good. Little did I know that was coming out of my place of unresolved pain and shame. That was still my way of getting back at the people that I was so frustrated by. And now I could use it with other pastors, and they liked it. But it was so dangerous. I'll come back to that church later on to wrap that story up. So while I'm there at that church, I'm introduced to the reality that there's shame in my life, and here's how it happened. There were 3 of us that met every week to do, I guess we didn't know back then, but it's group spiritual direction is what we were doing. It was like 45 minutes to an hour on your life, and then your life, and if we have time, we do the third, or if not, next week when we come back, you're on. And we just did that week after week. We were 3 guys that were all successful. I was the pastor, but we would cry together and spill our guts and do what we needed to do. And one day when I was spilling my guts, Joel, who was at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology getting a counseling degree. It was called Mars Hill back then, not to be confused with the church. They changed their name and said it has nothing to do with the church. It had everything to do with the fact that they didn't want to be associated with the church, but we won't talk about that. They changed their name, and so Seattle School of Psychology and Theology. I started to ponder my shame. And I had to come to realize my wife was in that program at that school working on a counseling degree. And Joel was at that school working on his counseling degree. And Joel said to me in our session one day as a threesome, as a triad, after I talked, he said, "Morris, that sounds like shame." And I looked at him and said, "I don't even know what you're talking. I don't know what that is. I don't know what you're referring to." I had no awareness for shame. It was like I've had 100,000 shame experiences in my life, but I had no awareness that I was living in shame. And it was on that day when Joel, who was taking his program at the school, brought that to my light that I said, "Oh my goodness, there's a whole emotion operating in my life that's viral. That's like this blood clot gene mutation that I never knew I had all my life. And now at age 50, I'm waking up to, I've got a blood clot that relates to more than just a blood clot. It relates to the gene mutation. And I have shame, which is a spiritual mutation that works in your system. And you have to be aware of it. And if you're not, it will run things in your life that you are not even aware of that they're going on around you, why you're functioning the way you're functioning. So that's what I want to dig in with you to wrap up. So in his book, John Bradshaw, in the 1980s, he wrote a #1 New York Times bestseller called Healing the Shame That Binds You. Non-believer, not written from a Christian perspective, but an incredibly helpful book. And shame hit the radar back in the 1980s, and then it went quiet again, and now Brene brought it back, as Greg referred to her. And if you haven't watched her videos, you should there on TED Talks. So it seems like shame goes underground and then people become aware of it again, and we are in a season of increased awareness. And it's like, at least within some churches and some pastoral communities like we are here today, we're putting shame out in the open. Greg, as hard as that was, and Annette and Ron, as hard as it's been for you, you guys exposed shame. And that is one of the most powerful things we are called to do as leaders. And we're going to see how Jesus did that as we work our way through today. So, the title of this is No More Shame on You. And I ended up in the psychiatrist's office saying, I am overwhelmed by shame. Bradshaw says in his book, 10 years ago, I had one of those life-jolting discoveries that significantly changed everything. I named shame. This means that I became aware of the massive destructive power of shame exerted on my life. I discovered that I had been bound by shame all my life. It ruled me like an addiction. I lugged around inside of me a dead weight of, Brene Brown's phrase, Greg referred to it, not good enoughness. I lugged around inside of me a dead weight of that not good enoughness. That's how we'll define shame today. And that's how most professionals would define shame. That deep inner sense that you've been caught in an incident or a situation or experience where you feel unworthy, not good enough. I want to help us to understand that better. There we go. pastors have a blind spot. In a word, that blind spot is shame. We don't learn about shame in seminary. We don't find it in our theological reading. We don't recognize it on the pages of Scripture. We don't see it in our people. So we need to back up and begin to process how shame is an incredibly hidden emotion, and how damaging it is when we're not aware of it and it starts to run rampant in our lives for 50 years without saying, that's shame and I know what it is. I can name it now. And if there's anything important that's happening today as a result of the stories and your discussions at the tables, it's that you would be able to name shame in your life and see it when it's happening and begin to bring it to God rather than let the enemy just play around with it and you not even know. If you study shame in the Bible, if you look at it as a narrative and say, I'm looking for shame, you will find it from the beginning to the end of the Bible. And yet we don't see it. If you study shame in your life, when you finally wake up, you will find shame everywhere. Shame is making an attack on your life every day. I sat there and shame made an attack on my life in the last 3 hours. I'm not good enough to do this today. How many of you speak on Sundays or in some place and you just always feel before your talk, this isn't good enough? This is just not good enough. And what's the first thing you feel after you sit down when you've spoken publicly? A wash of shame. And there are a lot of guys, if they're married, turn to their wife and say, was that okay? And that's their first way out of their shame, to get someone to ratify that you were okay today, even after you've preached for 20 or 30 years. That's what public speaking is all about. It's one of the most dangerous places, they say, where people can feel shame. And that's why most people don't want to be public speakers. Apparently, it's more scary than death. I think I'll speak publicly before I walk in front of a train. I am more, but people say it's the number one fear, to speak publicly. It's a shame-inducing experience. So, Brené Brown says, the less we understand shame and how it affects our feelings and thoughts and behaviors, the more power it exerts on our lives. The less we understand how it's exerting itself in our lives, the more power it has. Shame is clandestine. Shame is subversive. Shame is insidious, and shame is subconscious. So I feel sitting there today as we are exposing shame and as you are exposing shame in your discussions, that we are taking a knife to the very center of the enemy's workplace. And I'd like to help us truly understand that before I'm done. Let's talk about shame in your life. Shame in your life. The definition, obviously, is this. Don't go away without at least remembering this. It's the feeling of I'm not enough. You have to watch for that not enough feeling. You have to track it. I'm afraid of not being or doing enough for this person in this situation, as a parent, in my marriage, as a pastor, as a caregiver, as a neighbor. The feeling of I'm not doing enough. I'm not good enough. There are 3 critical areas that I want to get into to track today. 3 critical areas where shame shows up. Spiritual shame, not being enough for God. Ministry shame, not being enough for my calling. And relational shame, not being enough for others. We've been here already today. Several times. But I'll wrap it up by taking these 3 areas and pushing them deeper so that we sort of all end on the same page. Let's talk first of all about spiritual shame, not being enough for God. The question that we often ask or get asked, how are you doing spiritually? I hate that question. That question puts me on in a shame spiral as soon as it's asked. Because I'm not doing good enough spiritually. And in fact, the enemy is attacking me regularly, telling me I'm not doing good enough spiritually. My spiritual disciplines aren't good enough. My prayer life's not good enough. I could go down the list of not good enoughness. I don't reach out and care for my neighbors enough. I don't do enough work with people on the margins. I don't spend enough time in quality solitude. We don't make enough sacrifices financially to help other people. And you just start walking through the list. I've got a book in my library now of spiritual disciplines, and I think there's a list of like 30 spiritual practices. If you want shame, just read through the introduction and look over 30 spiritual practices and see how much shame will be induced in your life as you say, no, 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 no. Where should I get started, God? And when you connect your identity with God, your well-being with God, to how you're feeling about your spiritual life, if you project your feelings about yourself onto God, your shameful feelings onto God, you will feel a separation between you and God. That's why so many of us don't experience joy. It's why I have not experienced joy. For too long, I've allowed myself to believe that God feels about me the way I feel about myself. That's a lie. It's a shame lie, and it's one that has to come out first and foremost. I just want to illustrate what's happening between you and God by talking about an experience I had with my wife. Ruth's family lives in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And she flies to Calgary once in a while to visit her family. And I sometimes stay back. But on this particular occasion, she was flying to Calgary for the better part of a week and then coming back. And I knew I had a speaking engagement with pastors. Our retreat was going to last the better part of a week in Calgary. And then I just said to her, I said, hey, what day are you flying back from Calgary? And she said, oh, February, whatever. And I just went, this is crazy. I said, I'm flying in on the same day you're flying out. We will have been away from each other for a week, and then we'll be away for each other another week. And what time are you leaving the airport? And she told me, and I said, that's exactly when I'm coming into the airport. So I landed in Calgary, thinking about the reality that right about now my wife is getting ready somewhere at some gate to fly out. And I'm going through immigration. I'm heading for immigration customs. And you know how you walk, most airports, you walk down a long hallway and then you turn around. And you swear what they've done is just taken one hallway and divided it so that you walk down 5 times the same hallway back and forth. Because that's what it feels like you're doing, doesn't it? And you finally get to the last hallway that is going to take you down to immigration, the huge room where there's 1 million people. And as you walk along that hallway, there's floor-to-ceiling plexiglass, and you can look at the people on the, quote, Canadian side that are flying out, getting ready for their flights. And you're on the American side still, waiting to get through customs and immigration. And as I made my turn and came up to that plexiglass wall that ran all the way down, I looked up, and there was my wife looking at me on the other side of the plexiglass. Now, how do you show your love for your wife if you haven't seen her for a month and there's 3/4 of an inch of plexiglass between you and her? All I can say to you is, in my heart, I'm saying, I love you. And in her heart, she's saying, and I love you. But we can't connect. And in your spiritual life, if you project your feelings of shame and unworthiness onto God and think he feels about you the way you feel about yourself, do you know what? You will feel 3/4 of an inch of plexiglass between you and the one you love. It will wipe out shame in your life because you'll never be able to connect. Even though you love each other, even though you know that God loves me and I love him, you'll feel like all we can do is put our hands on the glass or go like this. Something silly that you might do for your wife to just say, I love you, but I can't talk to you. And there's so many of us in the Christian experience who have 3/4 of an inch of plexiglass. And I want to tell you what that is, you guys. It's shame. And it's robbing you of joy. So much of it is unaddressed shame that you have projected onto God because you think he feels about you the same way you feel about yourself. It's spiritual shame. And we feel like God turns the spotlight on our performance and says, you're not enough. And there's an internal voice of disgrace. Don't ask each other, how are you doing spiritually? That's a measurement question. Use the Wesleyan question, how is it with your soul? Or some form of that. Find another way in than asking them what will immediately throw them onto a performance strategy of whether I had my devotions in the last month or talked to somebody about Jesus. It's just the wrong way for us to operate. Spiritual shame. Next, let's talk about ministry shame. That has come out this morning a ton. Not being enough for your calling. Most churches and parachurch Christian organizations operate with measurables. How many people are here? How many people were here last Sunday? How many people were here a year ago on the same Sunday? And you go to the charts, and I used to go to our district conference, and the back of our district conference report folder was a list of all the 100 churches in the Pacific Northwest that were part of the Christian Missionary Alliance, my denomination. And you'd look down the list, and it would show the size of the church a year ago, 10 years ago, and now, and it would compare whether they're growing. And then we'd always talk about churches that were plateaued and declining during the church growth movement. Plateaued and declining. Those were like swear words, like you just never wanted to hear it about your church, right? Because you're one of the people that your church needs to be fixed. What we really were saying is 2/3 of the people on that list were plateaued or declining, and we're making all those pastors experience shame because the measurables are right out in front of everybody. Why? And then it was giving to missions. How many thousands of dollars were given to missions? It's just like, what are we trying to do to each other? I've worked with Christian organizations where there's measurables, youth organizations. How many clubs do you have? How many kids are in your club? How many kids do you take to camp? I was with Young Life just at Mount Angel Abbey yesterday, and they were talking about how the measurables just trap them up in their organization. And the church is just as sick as any parachurch organization when it comes to measurables. And comparison, you comparing yourself with other churches. How much shame is attached to that? I talk to pastors who used to be the rising church in the area, but now the declining church, because someone has come in with something slicker, better, more exciting. And in our consumer culture of church, people have moved from their church to that church, and the wound grows as their church plateaus or declines because something is more exciting. I don't want to do church on the I'm going to create something more exciting to keep you here track. You're going to shame yourself till the day you resign if you live in the world of comparison with other churches. Then you can talk about success. When you are success, you tie your identity to how you're doing. That is such a dangerous place to live. Shame lurks behind that door, looking for affirmation, needing affirmation, getting affirmation. Shame lurks behind that door. Criticism, receiving criticism. Shame doesn't just lurk behind that door. He's got a sledgehammer and wants to knock it down on every Christian leader anytime he can. One little ounce of criticism will knock you off your feet and shame you. Yet we let it go on and we don't track it. We don't ponder it. Ministry shame runs rampant and we have this deep feeling of not being enough. And then next, I want to talk about relational shame, as if the other two weren't. But I just have to get outside of God and church and just talk about everything else for a minute. Not being loving enough towards family. Not loving your parents enough and caring for them the way you think you should. There's a lot of people that are the age of people in this room who think you should be doing more for mom and dad right now, but you're not good enough. And you're shamed by what you haven't done. There's people in the room here today, I'm one of them, who's carried a ton of shame about not being enough for my wife. If I'm at a men's event and I ask, I want all the guys to stand up who feel ashamed that they're not good enough for their wives. It's just almost like a unanimous, if I did it, standing. We all, men, feel shame about not being good enough in our marriages. We don't talk about it. We avert. We find schemes. We try to prove ourselves in other ways. But we carry deep shame about our marriages. And I'm guessing that there are tons of women. I know my wife says, well, I carry shame about not being enough for you. I want it to be, I know what kind of guy you are and what you love, and I'm not that kind of person. I don't like motorcycles, and I don't like the things you like. So you'll have to ride by yourself. And I know she feels shame about all of that kind of stuff, of not being the wife that she thinks I want. There's shame about parenting. I'm tired of putting the parents on the stage and somebody saying, all of our children are loving the Lord and serving Him. Every person sitting in the church who has a kid or more than one who isn't loving the Lord and serving him is feeling deep shame at that moment. If you don't learn to deal with that wound of shame, if you have kids that aren't walking, my 2 boys have drifted away from church. They're not angry or mad at God, but they are done with church and there's no spiritual momentum in their lives. And I'm a pastor. Your kid's growing up in the church and doesn't like the youth group. And you go, well, you got to go. You got to go because it'll look bad if the pastor's kid doesn't go. And that's shame on me, so shame on you. Get there. Right? It's terrible the way it works insidiously into not only our life, but then the lives of the other people that make us look bad in our family unit. Our marriage isn't good enough. Well, it's my husband's fault. It's my wife's fault. I'm ashamed at the way we function in public, the way we argue sometimes in front of other people, or the fact that we've gotten ourselves into this difficult situation financially. The shame that runs in marriage and parenting. Not being enough for your neighbors. How many people are sitting here today saying, I should know my neighbors better? Shame of not being good enough for your coworkers and say, we don't get along as good as we could wherever you work. It could be a behavioral issue. You're ashamed of your fact that you struggle with anger or depression or an addiction of some kind. Body image. I'm just touching on massive shame areas that have already been highlighted by our communicators today. So we got the 3 areas. Let's move on. Shame people translate criticism of what they do into judgment of who they are. They take it on as their identity. The feeling of shame is about our very selves, not about some bad thing we did or said, but about who we are. It tells us that we are unworthy. Shame actually becomes an identity. And we don't even know it till age 50. It's been secretly, covertly at work in my life. So, I think Brene Brown has given us some of the best stuff on shame, but what she hasn't done is provided a good theological foundation. Let's go there and find out that shame is the narrative from the very beginning. But let's find out how dangerous it was and still is. Theological foundation. Adam and his wife were both naked and felt no shame. Why not? They were both naked and felt happy. Why not? They were both naked and in love. Why not? They were both naked and felt confident. Why? They were both naked and felt no shame. Because nakedness is the most vulnerable we can get. And when you're naked before someone, anytime we refer to a type of nakedness, like after I've preached sometimes, I step down and I say, I feel naked. I feel like I hung out something vulnerable and I feel naked. We use that term, I feel naked, not when we're literally naked, they were, but we use it to refer to the most vulnerable experience we could possibly have. And they were naked and unashamed. And the Bible used the unashamed word for a specific reason, because it comes out in the rest of the narrative, and it comes out in the rest of the Bible all the way through till Jesus shows up and deals with the nakedness and shame issue. So, when we read Genesis 2 and 3, we read it and look for sin. And we preach on the sin of Adam and Eve. Stop. It's a shame narrative. Look at the story. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. That's a shame narrative starting up, right? And it continues on. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And they hid from the Lord among the trees of the garden. That's a shame narrative. First, they become ashamed of themselves. Now they're ashamed of God. But the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" And he answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And then if I were to continue to put the rest of the story up, what happens? The shame spills not only on my body's naked, and I don't feel safe with God. But Adam turns to Eve and says, and I don't feel safe with her anymore. And she says, and I don't feel safe with you anymore. And we have the introduction of shame that has ruptured your relationship with yourself, your relationship with God, and your relationship with everyone else that's in your life. And that's the operative nature of shame, to wreck relationships. That's where it starts. That's where it has to end. It is a relational disease that is a virus floating through our bodies and surfaces all the time when relationships create shame, or we think of other people thinking a certain way about us when they're not even thinking that way. Or we think that God's thinking a certain way about us when he's not even thinking that way. It's a relational connection that takes place in our soul that we're ashamed, we're naked, and we can't handle it. So it's a shame narrative. It's a sin narrative, but it's a shame narrative. I think God wants us to see that shame is the first and primary emotion that enters the fallen world. And that the enemy loves shame as his first landing place to wreck relationships. It's his starting point. We go on. Shame is not simply, and now I'm quoting from the one book. If I could step off the stage right now and insert this in your brain and say, I'm done, I would insert it in your brain and say, let's leave. The Soul of Shame by Kurt Thompson. The Soul of Shame by Kurt Thompson. If anything today is resonating with you, read this book. Okay? I'll quote from Kurt. Shame is not simply an unfortunate random event, emotional event. It is both a source and result of evil's active assault of God's creation. He goes on to say, in other words, Genesis 2:25 is not just a passing description of humankind before Genesis 3. It is drawing our attention to the emotional fulcrum around which the history of sin rotates, the fundamental source, harbinger, and herald of what is to come. As such, in the biblical narrative, when we experience shame, we are not simply encountering one of an array of possible emotions. Rather, we are engaging in evil in its most fundamental mode of operation. Shame is the emotional weapon that evil uses to corrupt our relationships with God and each other. It's the first destructive emotion that wrecks and brings out a lot of the other emotions that are difficult. Anger, fear, anxiety, depression. Shame can act behind all of those by setting you up if you carry a shame identity in your life. Shame has been called then the master emotion. And when it's internalized, all other emotions are bound by it. Bradshaw, in his book, says, any human emotion can become internalized. When internalized, an emotion stops functioning as an emotion and becomes an identity. Toxic shame is no longer an emotion that signals our limits. It is a state of being, a core identity. Some of us don't realize that we lead shame-based lives. And up to age 50, I didn't realize that it was at the core of my identity. My need to succeed, my focus on becoming heroic was driven by shame. And when I succeeded, it reduced the shame and made me feel good. But as soon as something asserted itself, like the Woodinville church experience, I went off the edge of the cliff. So let's move to a Christological answer for shame. Let's take a look at what Jesus puts on the table for us. Here comes Pastor Jesus. 3 things: the incarnation, the friend of sinners, and the crucified one. Let's talk about the incarnation. Read the text again in your brain with me, but notice what it means that Jesus is doing in terms of opening himself up to the possibility of shame. How would this work for you, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. How many of you have ever been demoted? How many of you have ever been slipped down the ladder? How many of you have ever experienced this sort of experience, this giving up equality, giving up status, giving up a place that you've worked to and got pushed back down to a place where your identity couldn't be found in that anymore? Jesus does that to the 10 to the 1,000th time more than any of us ever would have. To have been God and suddenly be a fetus and then be crawling around in the dirt and eating with his hands like our little grandchildren do because they can't use utensils yet. And growing up and hurting himself and struggling and saying and learning that by faith that I am the Son of God, I'm the member of the Trinity, and becoming aware of that and saying, but I can't use that to my advantage. I will not use that to my advantage. Paul and I are good friends. I just gave up the role of being executive director of Soul Formation after founding it and running around for 10 years, and Paul being willing to work with me. And Paul has so many great skills that what he didn't know is I was actually letting him run Soul Formation without letting him be the executive pastor. And I finally just said, you know what? I don't like this. You're good at it. Do it. And then enter shame. You're not good enough. People have forgotten you. And I'm just got to go, deal with it, Morris. Just deal with it. Downsize. I find great joy in following Paul. But all of a sudden, the enemy will see just a little thing in our staff meeting, and I'll feel shamed because I've not here anymore. I've moved under his leadership, which is a great way to grow spiritually. But it's challenging. I meet too many pastors who, when they're finally done with the ministry and have no pastoral identity, live in a complete upside-down world because their identity was all about leading other people, and now they feel they're not being noticed or valued or wanted anymore. So those of us who are getting older in ministry need to figure out how we're going to downsize our emotional world and not be needed as much as we used to be without being shamed. And if your identity is ministry, get ready for a load of shame when you're finally not on the stage. Jesus could have felt a load of shame when he was no longer on the stage with the Father and the Spirit. When he was hidden among us, he said, I'll do that. I'll give that up. I'll do the incarnation. And then, as the enemy comes along, what does Satan do to Jesus after he's told that you are part of us? This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased, the baptism. This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Off to the desert, and Satan says, if you're enough, turn the stones to bread. And he's saying, I am enough. I am God. God has told me who I am. This is my identity by faith. I'm taking it by faith. Well, then turn the stones to bread. How dangerous and slippery could that slope be when he was that hungry? I'm God. Why don't I just do that? Or take care of your respect. You're the son of God. You're part of the triune relationship. So jump off the temple and let people know who you are. How dangerous and slippery is that? Or take care of your authority, because I can have all the kingdoms of the world bow down to you right now. They actually should be bowing down to you if you're the Trinity, if you're part of God, if you're alongside the Father and the Spirit. This is yours. I have it right now, but I'll give it all to you and let you be the man. And he says, Jesus could have said, yeah, I think I'd like that. And he says, no. In all three cases, Satan is shaming Jesus. He's shaming him around his incarnation. He's trying to take Jesus away from his incarnation, back to his full status to be able to employ his deity. And Jesus is saying, I can't do that. That was the decision we made, Father. I can't do that. So whenever we experience a kenosis experience where we have to self-empty a little bit, you can bet there's going to be shame going on in our lives. And Jesus has been there. Jesus in the incarnation. Next, here comes Pastor Jesus, friend of sinners. Luke 7:34. Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Is that shaming talk to you guys? How would you feel? Robin Stockett says, the most striking thing about the earthly ministry of Jesus is that he frequently chose to enter places of shame and associate with shamed people. That's the powerful work of Jesus. Zacchaeus is a despised man, and he's up in the tree, and Jesus is walking along with the crowd, and he calls Zacchaeus out of the tree and says, I'm coming to your house for dinner tonight, and takes Zacchaeus' shame on himself, because all the people say in the text, it says, all the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. The crowd that's walking with Jesus and high-fiving and having a great time with Jesus is now muttering and that fast saying, no, we don't like this. He's gone to be with Zacchaeus. And what other stories shall we tell you about? The woman caught in adultery. Jesus stands beside her to the end in all of her shame. The prostitute at Simon the Pharisee's party. Jesus lets her worship and then says to Simon the Pharisee, she loves me much because she understands that she's been forgiven much. You don't seem to understand that because you never even washed my feet when I came in the door. But look what she's done. And he stands beside the shamed woman. The untouchables like the leper. You touch a leper in that culture and you should have rubber gloves on. Jesus is going, no problem for me. The woman in the issue of bleeding. You touch that woman who's leaned over all her life, who's bent and struggling, and Jesus realizes he's been touched, which means you don't go into the temple for a week until you're cleansed. Jesus violates all the boundaries with untouchables. Annette, you talked about Peter on the beach. Jesus lifts Peter's shame off of him completely and says, get back in ministry with me. I am not going to shame you. Shame-bound people were not intimidated by Jesus. They were drawn to him in life and found release from shame. Here comes Pastor Jesus, the crucified one. Table conversations at 2:15. Yeah. It's 2:15. Here comes Pastor Jesus, the crucified one. Here are the shameful things going on. The arrest. How shaming. Abandonment by disciples. How shaming. Trumped up charges. Shaming. Mocking, hitting, spitting. Shaming, scourging, shaming, carrying the cross, shaming, being nailed to the cross, the height of shaming. No, hanging between two thieves. No, the religious leaders mocking him and saying, come down if you're the Son of God. No, that's not the height of shaming yet. He always has a loincloth on in all of our religious art. He didn't have a loincloth on you. He hung naked. That's the way the Romans always crucified people. They rolled dice for his last piece of clothing, his loincloth. He's naked. And I believe Jesus is up there and saying, all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, I am naked and unashamed. And the reason I say that is Jesus is undoing the shame game. Look at this, Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. I don't have to read the whole verse. I'll just point to the part, we'll light that up. Point to the part that says, he scorned its shame. If you're going to start tracking shame in your life and do what Jesus did, he had all the shame of the world on him and at him on the cross. And he scorned that shame. To scorn something means to recognize it as destructive, something you don't want, something that shouldn't be introduced into your life. And so you make the decision to start to put it down, to scorn it, to reject it, to eliminate it, to disempower it. You do everything you can to say, this is not what I want in my life. I recognize it and I draw limits around it in the name of Christ. I know the shame that I could carry. I will not. I will despise it. I will scorn it. That's the way forward for Jesus, and it's the way forward for us. Look at Jesus scorning the shame in this verse here, Isaiah 50. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting, because the sovereign Lord helps me. I will not be disgraced. Therefore, I have set my face like flint. I know I will not be put to shame. I want to offer one more. There are lots we could cover today, but I just quickly want to go to where Greg went. You come out of, where everybody's gone this morning. You come out of shame by getting back into community with people where shame could be or might sense shame as you begin to unpack it. So I told the people at the table when we were sharing what's a possible shame area, I said, for me, it's getting up and speaking today and following what's already happened. Vulnerability is the way we shame shame. We get together with other people and talk about it. And at first we think that if I talk about porn or eating or alcohol addiction or struggle in a relationship or the fact that I'm depressed or have an anger problem or I haven't had a quiet time in a year or whatever it is I'm going to talk about, I'm going to feel more shame when I talk to somebody. But if you are with a safe person, and you need to make sure you are going to undo that shame. And my last story is how unshame was undone in my life. I left the church in Seattle embittered. I was embittered for quite a while. I never split the church or talked to anyone in the church, to the best of my recollection, about what I felt about what had happened there. Because I said, my honor's on the line in terms of being a pastor of integrity. But do you know who I went and talked to about the shaming experience of that church and my feeling of failure there? I talked to all my colleagues in ministry in other cities. Until finally, they were looking for a new pastor. 5 years later, the first pastor came and went. So they're waiting, and our district office sends someone to the church, and while he's there, he comes back, and he and I happen to have a meal together, and he says, you know Woodinville Alliance? I was there, and they said, we know Morris was really hurt when he came here because he shared it with other pastors, and that has gotten back to us because we're trying to find a pastor now, and we kind of feel like we've been blacklisted. And I go, no, it's not appropriate to tell your shame outside of the boundary of just your church. I needed to be very careful how I was handling my brokenness in all places. I needed a safe place to unpack. So here's how it ended, and here's where I end. 7 years after I left Woodinville Alliance, I called the interim pastor because they're still looking for someone. And I said, can I come back? And can I meet with anyone who was an elder or a key leader? And they said yes, but they want to bring their wives because they were all men. And he said they want to bring their wives because their wives are tired of being out of touch with what's really going on in the center of the leadership of this church. And this sounds big. And I go, thanks a lot. I really want your spouses there too. I said, go ahead. I went there and I sat in front of them, maybe 15 people in a circle. And my wife, the counselor, on the way out, looked at me and she said, why are you doing this? And right then and there, I had to get all of my motives corrected in my soul. And I said, I'm doing this not against them, but for me to deal with what I need to deal with regarding my issues that infected them. And I took 15 minutes to unpack two things with them. One, I did not love you well. Because I'm a two who wants to be loved and needs to be needed and likes to be liked. So I was a manipulative pastor, though it didn't look like it. I was. And I need to own that. I was conflict avoidant. Which is the second one. I didn't lead well. as a conflict avoidant person in a dysfunctional church, you've got to be willing to walk into conflict. And I was always turning around saying, what can we do to get out of conflict? I'll just love more people. And I loved myself into the psychiatrist's office, trying to do that in the church. That's what I did. And do you know what happened on that day? By the time we were done and I walked out of that church, I felt like chains had broken off of me. And I felt like I never needed to talk negatively again about that church. The shame was released in the very community where it had birthed. So here are your questions. Why don't you flip it ahead for me and just pop them up? How aware have you been of how shame is shaping your world? Are you awake? What would you need to do to begin tracking and naming shame? And the second question is, what patterns or behaviors in your life might be connected to shame? Drivenness, compulsiveness, nervous habits, defensiveness, hyper-responsibility, people-pleasing. Thanks, Paul, for those questions. Paul and I teach on shame in a number of places, and those are excellent questions. I'd like you to get into your table talk and process them now. Thank you.